California Native Plant Society, and with me is Rahina Surendran from the Design Intent landscape architecture firm, and Peter Brastow from San Francisco's Department of Environment. And we're going to talk about biodiversity in Northern California from policy to implementation. We'll be discussing UN Sustainability Development Goals 2, 11, and 15, the circular economy and biodiversity, California's agricultural dependence on native pollinators, how native plants feed biodiversity, cities and biodiversity, funding biodiversity, and policies for biodiversity. We'll be discussing 3 of the Sustainability Development Goals: ending hunger, sustainable cities, and halting biodiversity loss. The circular economy is dependent on biodiversity. Biodiversity supplies the natural capital that is used by the circular economy, in addition to the pollination services that contribute to sustainable agriculture and local food systems. Native plants feed our pollinators and the insects that feed the rest of the ecosystem, and introduced and invasive plants fail to feed our local ecosystems. Recent presentation and paper by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services has shown that climate and biodiversity are linked. You don't solve one without solving the other. And economists, please understand, extinctions cannot be reversed, no matter how much money people in the future have. So we need to fix this now if we want to maintain the pollinators that maintain our ecosystem. California's agriculture is worth $50 billion US, and organic agriculture is 10 billion of that. Pollinator-dependent agriculture is $4 billion of California's crops. California has over 400 commodity crops, 100 of which are bee-pollinated. 65 of our native bee species were seen pollinating crops in 2 of California's counties, reducing dependency on imported pollinators. Honeybees are native to Europe and Asia. They are not native to the United States, so they were imported here. And honeybees are moved around to support agriculture across the United States. But our native bee species also provide agricultural services, and they are an important part of supporting California's agriculture. In addition to native pollinators, we have additional native insects that provide integrated pest management services, especially for organic agriculture. Native plants feed biodiversity. Professor Doug Tallamy at the University of Delaware and his graduate students investigated how many different kinds of caterpillar species are fed by the leaves of both native and introduced species, specifically in the Delaware area. And then he was funded to collect that information for every United States county across the United States. And it turns out that willows, oaks, and cherries support hundreds of different caterpillar species that use their leaves in their caterpillar form. If we do not have caterpillars, it turns out we also do not have baby birds. Baby birds need to eat caterpillars. Again, that research was done by Doug Tallamy and his graduate students, and that has been published. 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars are required to feed one nest of chickadees in the Washington, D.C. area. We must have caterpillars in our landscape to feed the rest of our ecosystem. And in addition to looking at native plants, introduced plants were evaluated to see if those leaves feed caterpillars, and most introduced plants feed between 0 and 2 insects. So even in California, when we look at an East Coast maple tree, it feeds between 0 and 2 insects, and maple trees from Europe feed between 0 and 2 insects, and eucalyptus feed between 0 and 2 insects. We must have the native plants in our landscape to feed our caterpillars, to feed the rest of our ecosystem. And the insect declines that we are experiencing across the planet are affecting the birds that we used to have in our landscape. When we don't have the insects, we don't have the birds. Our insects require those native plants. We don't have those native plants, we don't have the insects, and then we are unable to feed our baby birds. In the United States, we used to think that if we stuck all of our biodiversity and wildlife in a park, that would work. We would be able to continue to have our ecosystems function, and in two very different studies, that has been determined to be just not true. In a study for our German nature preserves, they looked at insect biomass declines over time, and that decline was also seen in a Puerto Rican nature preserve. Again, insect biomass decline over time. In the United States, only 4% of our land consists of national parks, state parks, and protected areas. So we cannot depend on parks to save our ecosystems. In the United States, there is a difference between who owns what kind of land and what they can choose to plant. And it looks like private ownership of land is what drives planting decisions. So that includes companies as well as residential. But we've got to have private owners make decisions, make better decisions about what to plant if we are going to sustain our ecosystem functions. Cities can and must support biodiversity. Cities are connected to the regions around us, and San Francisco's Estuary Institute was funded to write a report called Making Nature City, and they defined urban biodiversity success factors. This report is available for free on their website in English and in Spanish. And their top urban biodiversity success factors were native plants, the quality of the green space, so no invasive plants, reduce the introduced plants, reduce the lawn, green corridors as stepping stones between larger green spaces, so homes and business industry can choose to plant native plants and so provide the food for wildlife as they move between larger green patches. And also green patch size. Some of our wildlife requires a larger space to live. Coyotes, California quail, a variety of different wildlife require a larger green patch. So larger green patches that exist are important. And then to take special care of large trees and water. So let's look at some different cities and how they are approaching managing their ecosystem. So San Francisco's got a very complex ecosystem in a very small space. In 122 square kilometers, we've got over 400 kinds of birds. We've got 35 different butterfly species and 150 different native bee species. We currently have 500 plants, although there's 261 plants that are no longer in San Francisco that were previously recorded here, and 22 of the plants that remain of those 500 are rare. I am ashamed to admit that we have 10 federally endangered species, butterflies, frogs, and one of our butterfly species is already extinct. 68% of San Francisco is paved, and less than 5% of our natural landscape remains. So every plant we choose to plant is an opportunity to feed biodiversity. And that's a plant chosen at the city level, the state level, the federal level, because all of those entities own land in San Francisco as well as private choices. One of our butterflies is the Western monarch. So back in 1997, we had over 1 million Western monarchs. So Western is west of the Rockies. There's a population of monarch butterflies that's very famous that's east of the Rocky Mountains. West of the Rocky Mountains, we have a Western monarch population. 1997, I'm assuming everyone who's listening was born by 1997. So in your lifetime, we have gone from over 1 million Western monarch butterflies to under 2,000. So this is one of the butterflies that is one of our pollinators that supports and provides pollination services to agriculture and to the other plants that we use to breathe, to clean our water, to sequester carbon. And every time we lose a pollinator, we lose the resiliency of our ecosystem. And that is what is happening with the Western monarch. We are losing a pollinator and we are losing resiliency. And this is a very famous butterfly here in California. People have been encouraged to plant for it for years, and yet we are still experiencing a population crash. In San Francisco, we established local biodiversity resolution as a citywide priority, and we are currently working on a climate action plan for which includes healthy ecosystems in addition to other approaches to managing our climate. And that healthy ecosystem strategy does include native plants and doing a better job of optimizing our urban forest and restoring our parks and natural lands and open spaces. It is a work in progress, and that is still in draft and unfunded. There are a variety of different policies for each city and open space in California. They've got their own biodiversity policy. Portola Valley and Mountain View, California, are both in Northern California, just south of San Francisco. Portola Valley has got the best biodiversity approach in all of California. They require native plants. They especially prioritize the native oaks, which feed over 200 caterpillar species, and they're currently working on removing their fire risk introduced plants that were planted earlier in their history. Eucalyptus, as was discussed by the previous speaker, is a plague in California. It is an invasive plant here, as well as a fire risk. And so Portola Valley is working on finding the funding to remove the eucalyptus and to remove the pines that are contributing to a fire risk. Mountain View, California has no biodiversity requirements. Of the 250 different tree species they permit, only 2 of them are local native plants. Out of the 21 local native trees they could choose to have on their list, they just have 2. The coast redwood has extensive planting in Mountain View, California. That is a wonderful ecosystem plant, but only when you plant it with the rest of its understory plants. And that's just not how it's used in Mountain View. Their oak, one of their oaks, is the other second tree, but they've got 250 other species that are planted across Mountain View. And so they have less biodiversity than is available in a place like Portola Valley. In San Francisco, we have that biodiversity resolution, but no requirement. And as of now, we have 125,000 different street trees. Less than 1% of those, just over 700 of those, are native trees. In 2019, we did add all 14 of our drought-tolerant local native trees. We did not include the willows that are not drought-tolerant trees on our approved street tree list. So people have more choices now to plant native. And the updated 2021 San Francisco street tree list added all of the pollinator information, including the caterpillar information, in the hopes that when people look at the approved street tree list, they will make better choices. But again, it's a choice and not a requirement in San Francisco to plant native. So funding biodiversity is if we don't have funding, it's hard to move forward. There is funding at the United States level, both direct funding, tax incentives, and fees. States have direct funding, tax incentives, and fees. And this is very small amounts of direct funding. Primarily, things are funded by, biodiversity is funded by tax incentives. Water companies, especially west of the Rockies, that is the dry part of the United States. Water companies have been encouraging drought-tolerant planting since the 1970s and are now beginning to change from drought-tolerant plantings to specifically drought-tolerant local native biodiverse plantings. because again, in cities and suburbs, every plant choice makes a difference. You can plant a drought-tolerant plant that only sequesters some carbon, cleans some water, and cleans the air, or you can do a drought-tolerant local native that also gives you that ability to feed caterpillars and feed the rest of your ecosystem. It's possible to get grants and nonprofit funding, and those nonprofits have got tax incentives to provide that funding, and then private funding has got long-term tax incentives. The lack of maintenance funding is contributing to ongoing biodiversity losses, both through extensive wildfires and through native plants. That lower picture is an open space in New York that has just been covered by the invasive plant kudzu. So what are the biodiversity policies that we're recommending? We're recommending that there be goals, measurable and time sensitive. California currently has a goal of 30% of our land being restored to biodiversity and full ecosystem services by 2030. We're recommending that there be funding for biodiversity baselines so that we can measure what we are managing, that there's funding for biodiversity enhancements, and that there is funding for maintenance to enhance biodiversity. And that maintenance funding needs to manage our fire risks and manage our invasive plants, as the prior speaker and questions were addressing the eucalyptus impact on soil and ecosystems. It's dreadful, and we've got eucalyptus just across California. It's awful. And there's a patchwork of policies that use tax incentives and fees, and so far they are failing to prevent ongoing biodiversity losses, as we saw with the dreadful loss of the monarch butterfly population. And so rules, ordinance, and requirements to plant natives are the best way to enhance biodiversity. Thank you to all the people who provided all of the pictures and all of the research. This is the California Native Plant Society, association with the City of San Francisco, and Design Intent. I'm ready for questions.
Thank you, Susan. I open the floor for questions. I can start then, so the others have time to think. Actually, I have two questions. What about the sort of the legal system? Is there any option or possibilities to enforce the different strategies? I mean, I noticed that the majority of the land is privately owned. So the question is, to what extent does the legal system allow for enforcing some changes? Or will it all be based on sort of awareness raising and the goodwill of individual landowners?
So we've been doing awareness raising for decades about the monarch butterfly, and that has gotten us to a population that has crashed. And so I think we have got the data that we need, that awareness raising is insufficient. We need requirements, and not just a resolution, as San Francisco has. We have not seen a greater amount of native plants planted since San Francisco put in a resolution. We need requirements, we need rules, we need ordinances. Portola Valley has got requirements, rules, and ordinances, and they've got an extensive amount of native plants, not only the trees, but also the understory plants, so that you've got climate resilient systems. If you just plant a native tree, you're going to get some goodness, but you need the rest of that ecosystem with it. Unfortunately, we need the legal system to back us up.
Yeah, I can add to that. As a landscape architect, I see in cities that have ordinances, the owners are, forced to plant trees rather than just have a patch of lawn. And in the cities that don't have ordinances, that's where the owners get away with just planting whatever they want to.
I have a kind of a related question when it comes to planting trees. I mean, one, it could be so that people are willing to do it, but are there seedlings available? Is there a program for raising enough seedlings to actually change the situation?
That's a really good question, and one that the California Native Plant Society, both the local chapters and at the state level, is working on. There's a Native Plant Society in every one of the 50 states of the United States, and so yes, there are seedlings available, seedlings and small trees. So thank you for asking that. That didn't used to be true, and it is now. We understand that if we are going to pressure cities, states, the federal government, and local people and businesses to plant native plants, we need to make sure that those plants are available in the industry and the nursery trade.
Okay, Justin has a question.
Leave you on mute.
Yeah, I muted myself. Susan, thank you very much for your presentation. I found it very fascinating. I'm an ecologist, and I focus on restoration, and I love that everybody wants to plant trees, but from my experience, very few people look after the tree after it's been planted. And
yes, we are seeing the same problem.
I can tell you that I've been involved in very many voluntary programs that have planted thousands and thousands of trees, and I've gone back to those areas and not a single tree is alive. So we are locked onto a narrative that does not have any future at all, unless we plan the long term. So, for example, right in the very beginning, when Ryanair sponsored Ryanair is one of the cheap or low-cost flying guys. It's run by an Irishman, and he was in my car while I took him on a drive around the area, and he said to me, "So, Justin, how long will it take for me to sequester carbon?" Another huge fallacy around planting trees. You know, we think that when we plant a tree this size, we've sequestered carbon. That tree will only start to really become part of that ecosystem once it's 15 or 20 years old. Before that, there's very little. It's the soil that's going to do most of the carbon sequestration. Anyway, my question was, with your funding, are you able to plan into the future? In other words, can you have longer term funding requirements? Because we are operating on 1 year at a time here. We get funds for 1 year, we plant 50,000 trees. Then we're successful. Then we get funds for another year, we plant another 50,000 trees. So we cannot plan into the future to look after and monitor and evaluate the work that we're doing. We have to find our own time to do it, which is what I do. I go out and do my own evaluations of these areas.
So we have been having trouble finding longer term funding within the city of San Francisco. So this is just the city, not the state, not the federal government, and not individual owners. But when the city has the money to plant a tree, that money is not only to buy the small plant or the seedling, but also to provide 3 years of water to it. So it is $2,000 a tree to put a tree into the city of San Francisco, because water tanks have to drive to it to water it to keep it alive. Our drought tolerant plants can survive our dry summers, but only once they've gotten big enough to do so, and that requires 3 years of water. So it's a very challenging system, and we have seen exactly what you're seeing in terms of if you do not water it, it will not live.
So that raises another question, because there are some technologies now that are helping people to plant trees. One is known as the cocoon technology, where you actually provide water in a tank around the tree, in a unit that actually dissolves. It's made of cardboard. And then from Africa, where I used to plant lots of trees to help recover areas that had been badly impacted by European decisions to change landscapes to forests for their own wood. And we used a system called clay pot irrigation. And that is an unfired clay pot which goes in with the trees, and then that requires only a matter of filling it up depending on the amount of water that the tree has. So it's an osmotic process, as with the cocoon. So we found that the amount of water we needed to apply was very, very little, and the time space between the application of water was also quite a lot longer, so it could be easily managed. I don't know if you've used some of that technology.
So I've seen the clay pot, although I have not seen it used at any of the city, state, or federal levels. And I have seen a version of the cocoon. We don't use cardboard, we use something else, but that does help some of our nonprofit trees go longer between being watered. It makes a huge difference. And I've seen greater success in terms of those street trees being successful.
There's also a gel called a hydropolymer, which has improved considerably since I first used it in South Africa. It used to leave little toxic gel parts around, but now it's become a lot more environmentally friendly. And we've used a bit of this, not a lot because it's experimental. And we found that the tree has the longest period of sustaining itself. Anyway, those are just some thoughts, because I would be very interested if you start to use that kind of technology, what are the results,
The only one that we're using at the city level, or that's being used at the city level and really by nonprofits that are planting within San Francisco, is a version of the cocoon, and that's working very well.
Good.
And a huge difference between not doing that and doing that. I've heard of the gels, but I haven't seen anyone use them, that's just me, that's my experience. Rahina, I don't know if you know of anyone who's been using that.
I have not heard of it, but I do know that all the cities that follow the water ordinance are required to have drip irrigation. So all the planting, even lawns have to have drip irrigation. So that's a big step.
Interesting. Wow, that's a long.
Right, thank you, Susan and Rahina.
Thank you.
Sounds like you have a reason to reconnect at some point and compare the results of different planting techniques to get the trees growing again. Any further question? We would have time for one more short question.
Yes, Becky, I was wondering whether Susan could tell me a little bit about the Native Plant Society in California. Is it a private organization? Where do you get funding from and so forth?
Thank you for asking. The California Native Plant Society is a nonprofit, and so we have tax incentives from the federal government and the state government. We get grant funding from larger foundations, and there are 50 native plant societies, one for every different state. Each one of us focuses on our native plants and the wildlife associated with those plants. And the California Native Plant Society at the state level has got an excellent plant selection tool. They recently added the butterfly caterpillar value to every one of the plants, and we've got 6,000 native plants in California. So it's, and I think 2,000 bees and hundreds of butterflies and moths. So we've got an extensive amount. We're a biodiversity hotspot, California is, and so it's important that all of that information be available for people who are making decisions about what to plant. But in America, we unfortunately have a tendency to want our plants to look like wax where nothing is chewed on, and so that's a really different change of approach. I'm trying to encourage people to plant more of a wabi-sabi approach where there's perfection in imperfection. That's a Japanese technique. So thank you for asking about the California Native Plant Society. Yeah, we are a nonprofit, and we are funded by donations.
Thank you.
Okay, we thank Susan and your co-authors for their contribution to the conference. Now we should turn over to a different topic, but not less important. We have historical sins and things to deal with from past industrial activities. So I leave the word to Faisal Sisan to present some of the work on identifying heavy metals in the biofiber banks related to pulp industry. So Faisal, please, you are welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Let me set things. Okay, so you have my slides. My name is Faisal Zishan, and I'm a postdoc researcher at Mid-Sweden University, Sweden. And today the topic of my presentation is study of heavy metals, including mercury, within fiber banks of Western Northland and Boston counties by portable X-ray fluorescence spectrometry. And I will give some background and introduction of my research, and then we'll discuss about the methods